In this video, we will talk about how different health conditions, different illnesses, and different diseases are stigmatized in different ways. So, some researchers or some individuals regard obesity as a form of weight discrimination, and this discrimination may apply more to women than men. And it seems that the stigma attached to obesity has more to do with a person's personality. The person may be perceived or stereotyped as lazy, not motivated, lack self-discipline, less competent, or even sloppy. And because of all these stereotypes, the obese individual may face all kinds of prejudice and discrimination. It seems that when people attach different stigmas in a form of personality stereotypes to overweight or obese individuals, they tended to quote-unquote blame the victim. But sometimes we know people gain weight because they have certain health conditions, certain diseases, and sometimes people can become obese due to factors beyond their control. And these are the stigma attached to TB or tuberculosis. And compared to the other illnesses like AIDS or the coronavirus or even depression, people with TB are more likely to disclose their status because apparently the stigma will stop when the coughing ceases. Maybe when they are healed, the stigma will stop. So because of that, they are more likely to tell people they have TB. And sometimes people diagnosed with HIV or AIDS, they may tell people they have TB or pneumonia or lung disease. So as we can see, the stigma associated with TB is very different from the stigma associated with AIDS and obesity, right? And when the person has TB, people may practice social distancing, like what we are doing now in the time of coronavirus pandemic. People may tend to distance themselves because obviously they know TB can be contagious. So people with TB are stigmatized through social distancing, and people who are obese are stigmatized because all these stereotypes are attached to their personalities. But the stigma would stop when they stop coughing, and research has confirmed that. And sometimes TB can also be stigmatized as a marker for HIV positivity, which is not very good. And sometimes the person may just have TB, we all know, but people may perceive that the person has HIV. The person just want to tell people that they have pneumonia or TB to play it safe, so to speak. And in some cultures, especially ancient cultures, or before the advent of all kinds of medical procedures and medical technologies, TB is perceived as a divine punishment. And centuries ago, people with TB may be stigmatized as a form of divine punishment. Maybe they did something wrong, they anger the gods, too bad for them. Or TB may be stigmatized centuries ago, before the invention of all these technologies and infrastructure. Those with tuberculosis may be perceived or stereotyped as immoral. So the stigma attached to a given disease, as you can see from here, can change over time and context with all kinds of inventions, medical inventions. Now, people's knowledge about TB increase, and they cease to stereotype or stigmatize those with TB as receiving a divine punishment, or they are a lot less inclined to stigmatize those with TB as an immoral person. But sometimes those with TB is still stigmatized as a marker for HIV positivity, whether they actually have HIV or not. And people with AIDS, even to this day, are stereotyped as an immoral person, even though we know AIDS or HIV, can spread through the fetus from the mother to the child, or in some highly patriarchal societies. Sometimes the woman may not have a lot of say when negotiating safer sex with their partners or their spouse, and that's how they contracted HIV, due to no fault of their own. So, AIDS is not always due to immorality. But even to this day, people still perceive that those with AIDS or HIV sometimes as a deviant or an immoral person. And it seems that stigma associated with AIDS depends on a person's level of health literacy. And back to my previous point, sometimes a person diagnosed with AIDS may be perceived as loose or having multiple partners, are less inclined to take precautions. But like I mentioned earlier, in some highly patriarchal societies, the woman may have no power to negotiate safer sex with their partners or their spouse. And sometimes it's too bad, so sad. The poor woman is being stigmatized as immoral or even deviant or as loose because she contracted AIDS or she tested positive for HIV. And because of all this stigma, the poor individual may be barred from all kinds of social events. And sometimes, to minimize those stigma, those tested positive for AIDS or HIV may tell people they have pneumonia or lung disease, or they are afraid to get tested. So this is what stigma of a disease can do to people. Some people may be less inclined to get testing. And I think stigma associated with coronavirus overlaps to some degree with stigma associated with AIDS or TB. Stigma associated with this virus has something to do with a person's health knowledge or health literacy. And I think the stigma associated with coronavirus has yet been ascertained, because nobody really knows how this pneumonia of unknown source originates. So, I think the stigma associated with coronavirus has yet been clearly defined. And we see, when this virus first came about, the French community or the Asian community in French, because they were discriminated to some degree, they developed a hashtag. It's called hashtag I am not a virus in both French and English. So maybe the stigma associated with coronavirus, unlike the stigma associated with AIDS, they are also based on a person's racial and ethnic groups. It's not so much, or it's not the case with AIDS at all. The stigma associated with AIDS, as is the case with the stigma associated with obesity, has something to do with a person's personality. And the person may be perceived deviant initially when it was thought that maybe the person consumed certain meats from certain animals, and that's how they contracted the disease. Certain groups of people from certain racial ethnic groups may be stigmatized because of this virus, because their dietary behaviors may be considered deviant. And it is also perceived that, which is also quite true, having close proximity to the contracted person, having close contact with the virus, like many medical and health professionals, sometimes it's highly likely that they contract the virus themselves. So, sometimes the stigma associated with the coronavirus also has something to do with the risk level of different segments of the population. Some segments of the population are exposed to higher risk, like airport personnel, maybe law enforcement officers, health professionals, or maybe homeless individuals, based on the way they live. And I think the level of risk attached to certain groups depends on the level of stigma they are going to receive pertaining to this virus. And because of that, maybe those belonging to the high-risk group, or those classified as the high-risk groups, they may be less likely to get tested because they want to avoid stigma. They may be less likely to disclose their status. And in certain working conditions where people have to work in close contact with another, or in close proximity to another, and if they need a paycheck, and if they are paid by the hour or by the day, and they cannot afford to miss a paycheck, they have to come to work, they may be less inclined to disclose their status. And because of that, the government proposing giving free testing is not a bad idea, as we can see. And people may tend to stay away from the high-risk groups as a result of all this stigma attached to the coronavirus. People may distance themselves from any Chinese-looking population or Asians because of that. And like I mentioned, the stigma associated with coronavirus, like AIDS, depends on a person's health literacy. And because of that, people with the virus may be for sure barred from any social events. And as you can see, the stigma attached to depression has something to do with stereotypes attached to the person's personality. A person showing symptoms of depression, any mental health issues, or PTSD, they may be perceived as insane or crazy, or a deviant. And they may also be perceived as dangerous. which is not always the case, we all know. And there's also a blame the victim mentality attached to the stigma of depression. You brought it onto yourself due to your substance abuse, your eating disorder. And sometimes people showing symptoms of anxiety, depression, PTSD, any mental health issues may be perceived as having communication problems. So as you can see, the stigma attached to depression has something to do with a person's personality and a person's ability. And because of that, we know depression, anxiety, mental health issues are stigmatized in a different way. And because of that, some people tend to hide their issues. They are not going to seek treatment. And when treatment is finally sought, the condition is pretty serious. It sometimes can lead to the person leaving scars on innocent people's life, right? We see all this in all kinds of shooting instances. Are we right? So, as you can see from all these examples, the stigma attached to all these diseases, illnesses, sometimes they overlap to a certain degree.